Hello and welcome to this Unit 7 video lecture, which will begin our examination of the Great Peloponnesian War, which is not to be confused with the conflict we explored in an earlier video lecture called the First Peloponnesian War. Indeed, that was a mere warm-up compared to the main event that we will be examining over the course of Units 7 and 8. This is a topic that deserves a lengthier treatment than the other topics we have studied because the Great Peloponnesian War lasted for 27 years, from 431 to 404 BCE, and it was a conflict that tore the Greek world apart. This war will involve all of the Greek world and some entities outside of it, including the Persian Empire, which will make an appearance in the closing phases of this conflict. The war itself will be fought not only between Athens and Sparta, but will also engulf the allies of both these leading poleis. Athens will have the support of the Delian League, while Sparta will rely on an alliance of its own, a network that modern historians call the Peloponnesian League. The Great Peloponnesian War is, even today, still amongst the most studied conflicts in all of history, and we can thank the historian Thucydides for that. Thucydides is going to be our primary source and our main guide as we navigate the intricacies of this very complex conflict. Now, on Thucydides, you should know that he was an eyewitness to many of the events he writes about. He lived through the conflict itself and was even a participant in one of the campaigns that will take place up north, near Macedonia. He was born in 460, and we're not sure when he died, but we know he lived to see the end of the Peloponnesian War and was in the process of finishing his history. He gets to the events of the year 411 BCE, and then, abruptly, his history breaks off mid-sentence. So his history of the Peloponnesian War is not a complete record of the conflict, but it certainly is the best analysis, because Thucydides provided much more scrutiny to his sources and provided a level of analysis that was lacking in the history of Herodotus. So we see that his legacy is not only the writing of a great history of a monumental conflict, but he is also known as the intellectual godfather of realism, a philosophy of international relations that is still very much studied and applied. The realist school is basically based on a pessimistic assessment of human nature and, by extension, of international relations. Realists follow Thucydides in strongly believing that human nature is fixed and unchanging, so past performance will predict future events. And realists believe that power is the ultimate arbiter of events, and no amount of wishful thinking will change that. Some prominent realists that have appeared on history's stage include Niccolò Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Otto von Bismarck, and more recently, Henry Kissinger. Now, back to the biographical sketch of the man himself. Thucydides was born in 460, so he is living in the heyday of the Athenian democracy, the radical democracy, as it has been labeled, during the age of Pericles. Indeed, Thucydides grew up knowing nothing but the leadership of Pericles. Now, Thucydides was of the Aristoi class. His family was very wealthy and controlled properties along the Thracian coastal area, where they were involved in gold mining. Thucydides spent his young adulthood in Athens, and when he grows to maturity, he is actually elected as a general in the year 424 BCE during the first phase of the Great Peloponnesian War. He only has a very brief military career because in his first official duty as a commander, he failed to prevent the Spartan takeover of a city called Amphipolis, and we'll look at that particular episode in more detail in a future lecture. But because of his failure, Thucydides is exiled from Athens for 10 years. Now, when he is exiled in 424, he decides that he will spend his exile as productively as possible, and this is when he decides to write a history of the conflict, which, by this point in time, had been raging for almost 7 years. So he was a proud Athenian up until his exile, but he was always suspicious of the Athenian democracy. Indeed, there are moments throughout Thucydides' history where he indicates that democracy does have certain vulnerabilities that need to be examined, particularly when it comes to the crucible of conflict. And Thucydides makes it clear that Pericles is the best man to run a functioning democracy, but of course, that sounds like a contradiction, that you have one person singled out to basically run a democracy, which technically is supposed to be a government by the people. Well, Thucydides understood and believed a government run by the people was ultimately unworkable, and that you needed somebody that could focus the people, that could keep them in check, someone who could map out short-term and long-term policies and goals for the democracy, and who could navigate the intricacies not only of foreign policy, but also of domestic politics. And clearly, Thucydides believed that Pericles was the man to accomplish all of those goals. And he really presents the image of Pericles as the quintessential wartime democratic leader. And Thucydides believes that when Pericles dies early on in the war, the Great Peloponnesian War, that is when Athens will almost immediately begin to lose its way. Indeed, Thucydides presents the death of Pericles as a pivotal event in the overall course of the war, because Thucydides believed that democracy is very vulnerable to demagogues, a term coined by the philosopher Aristotle to describe aspiring leaders who play on the passions of the people as a means of achieving their political success. Rather than rely on rational discourse, demagogues use raw emotion and highly charged rhetoric to fire up the common people and get them to support the demagogue, whatever policies the demagogue wants to implement. And Thucydides clearly has no patience with these demagogues who place their own political fortunes above all other goals. He singles out a politician named Cleon, who we'll look at in a later lecture, as the kind of demagogue who did not really have a long-term policy in place for the overall success of Athens, but simply used his inflammatory rhetoric to manipulate the people. Now, in his history, Thucydides makes it clear that he believes that the war he is writing about, this great Peloponnesian War, is a war like no other, and it deserves to be recorded for all of posterity so that it can be studied and future generations can draw lessons from it. Now, in many ways, his assessment of the Peloponnesian War is correct, certainly within the Greek context. For centuries, warfare in the ancient Greek world was governed by the rules of hoplite warfare, which made battles between Greek city-states relatively brief and decisive, so that the issue could be quickly resolved and both parties could go back to farming. What makes the Peloponnesian conflict a war like no other is its grinding length, 27 years, which was unprecedented in Greek history. And Thucydides notes that there were certain structural conditions in place that would allow this conflict to go on and on and on, seemingly forever. First, by 431 BCE, Athens and Sparta could ignore the old rules of hoplite warfare. We know that the Spartans didn't have to worry about getting their warriors back in the fields in time to harvest or to plow, because the helots were handling those agricultural tasks. So they could commit, theoretically, to year-round campaigning. And under the leadership of Pericles, the Athenians have devised a strategy that will allow them to wage war for years on end, continue the fight day in and day out. Thucydides makes it clear that Pericles understood that Athens and Sparta were on a collision course and anticipated fighting a war that would go on for years rather than months. He planned accordingly, stockpiling Athenian silver reserves, completing the long walls that linked the city of Athens with the port of Piraeus, and he made sure that the Athenian fleet was kept at a high state of readiness. But as circumstances would reveal, and as Thucydides noted, Pericles' foresight was no match for the unpredictable events that war unleashes.